So my friend's been asking me why I don't do more apologetic material, and this would be the first of many. I'm kind of taking an interesting method of going about this. I've been looking a lot into philosophy lately, in particular, like the philosophy of religion and philosophy as far as like the existence of God and that sort of thing. Been taking a long, hard look at Bertrand Russell as well as Descartes and some others. And so what I'm going to do today, I'm going to look at Bertrand Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian. Now, this is essentially going to be either the 1927 essay that Russell presented before this secular organization. If you're looking at the book form of Why I'm Not a Christian, this is really just the first chapter. So it's not going to be everything that is involved in the book form of Why I'm Not a Christian, which includes this essay as well as other essays he had written over the years, and the Russell Copleston debate, which, if you're going to watch this, I would recommend you just go watch that debate and try to digest it. It's very, if you have to have a certain understanding of philosophy to get at what they're arguing about. So it's not necessarily for everyone. But if you have any interest in this topic, it's interesting to hear Russell preaching to secularists and throwing up things and excuses why he is agnostic and why he's not a Christian, doesn't really believe in God, and see how, when that's challenged, how he reacts. But it's interesting how, he struggles even in 1927 the way a lot of us struggle today. How do we define the word Christian? It can't just be someone with a set of beliefs and that attempts to live a good life. That's majority of religions would fit that description. He laments that the word was not as ambiguous in the days of Augustine or Aquinas or Augustine. But two conditions you think would have to be necessary to be a Christian: believing in God and immortality, and belief about Christ as either a divine person or one of the wisest. Now, it's interesting to me how Russell doesn't really see any surpassing wisdom in the teachings of Christ, where others have, doubted Christianity, but still seen, Christ as a good teacher. We'll see Russell doesn't tackle that, but he really looks at two questions: the existence of God, and then the nature of Christ and his teachings, and some other asides. So he doesn't like the first cause argument. This is one of the first ones he mentions and addresses. Now he words it this way: everything we see in this world has a cause. There must be a first cause behind all this. The first cause is called God. Now he goes even further in the Copleston debate to say, well, because every man has a mother, there must be one mother of the human race, or something like that. Which actually I'm not even sure if that's an invalid statement. But anyway, he thinks this argument's invalid, and the way he sets it forth, I think I would actually agree. God would also need a cause. Potentially, he says the universe could not have a beginning, which always throws us off in our modern day, because our modern understanding of physics and the beginning of the universe, in 1927, that was still not something that people accepted. In 1976, with the war and flu debate, the idea that the universe had always existed was still a philosophical possibility. It wasn't a scientific impossibility. So the nature of this argument and this debate has changed significantly given modern science. Some lament, it seems like science, in finding this Big Bang cosmology, like the universe has a beginning, it's like they finally climbed the mountain of understanding, only to find that religious people were already there. Like, yes, the universe was created. And he thinks anyone who doesn't understand the possibility is just suffering from what he calls poverty of our imagination, which is a really good phrase. Sometimes we reject things because we can't imagine them, and that's true, but I don't think that's really the problem here. Um, so I use Grok 3 AI a little bit to try to cite the arguments as they're more commonly stated in a more valid form. Um, and the prime mover argument is different from what we typically think of the modern cosmological argument, or I guess I shouldn't say modern. Like, there are different forms of the cosmological argument. There's the deductive and inductive form. Kalam obviously is reference to the medieval uh, Islamic philosophers who would argue the same way, that there is one God and creator of all things. But classically, the prime mover argument doesn't depend on the universe having a beginning. It just depends on the universe being contingent, being created or caused by something or someone else, and ultimately God. So the idea is everything that's in motion, everything that is undergoing change, is moved or changed by something else. This is kind of, not to get sidetracked, like, well, no, I'll just stay on topic. An infinite regress of movers is impossible. And traditionally, this is true and understood between like Platonic philosophy, Aristotelian philosophy. Like, most philosophers prior to like the 1500s, like, again, modern philosophy and Descartes kind of question, well, maybe there could be infinite regress. But traditionally, no, that's just not the case. It'd be impossible. I think it's still rational and logical to say it's impossible. Copleston talks about, an infinite number of chocolates. Well, if there were an infinite number of chocolates, then there'd be nothing else in the universe. So an actual infinite can't exist. That's where William Lane Craig tackles this argument when he says an actual infinite can't exist. But even if it did, it still wouldn't explain where all the chocolates came from. What produced the chocolate? Like, an infinite number of chocolates, there's a chocolate factory. An infinite number of cars, there's a car factory. So the conclusion is there must be some sort of first unmoved mover, and there's question about whether that unmoved mover is God, and that's another discussion. But the conclusion is that there is an unmoved mover. Now, again, the Kalam argument specifies that everything that begins to exist has a cause. So God, being a non-contingent and necessary being, would not have begun to exist. So God does not have a cause. God is not self-causing. God just doesn't need a cause. And sometimes we play loose with that word, that phrasing. We say, well, God caused himself. Well, no, that's not accurate, and that's not helpful to the conversation. Since everything which begins to exist has a cause, now in modern times we understand the universe began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause. Now, going from there to God and using this argument by itself isn't necessarily sufficient. We have to take these arguments in tandem, like take them together. But Russell moves on rather quickly, given the time he had, and I'll try to be fair as far as that goes. Some argue that since there is natural law, there must be a natural lawgiver. We see elements of this. And, in his, again, this is 1927 understanding, a bit of an outdated understanding, the movement of planets. Newton would say it was designed by God. Einstein and modern ideas about gravitation were able to explain the planet's movements. So this becomes sort of a God of the gaps, We thought the planets moved this way according to rules because of God, but we have a natural way of explanation where they move this way just because of gravity and forces that we have a better understanding of. He thinks, there's 3 feet to a yard. In a distant galaxy, there's still 3 feet to a yard, but that's just a human convention, not a law of nature. And we do have to be careful about equating the two. But he appeals to, the newly formed understanding of quantum mechanics and chance on a small level. I want to give my opinion about that, but he says human laws are about how you ought to behave or how things ought to behave, and natural laws are about how things do behave. And at first, it sounds like he's going into morality, but I think he's just saying, human laws are, well, this is the way things are, and we can be wrong about our assessments, but natural laws would actually describe how things do behave. So again, human laws, like, well, the plants move this way, they have rules because God said so. And in this instance, well, there's natural reasons why the plants move and behave this way. That's one example. Before we move on, if things on a large scale move according to laws and rules, gravity, magnetism, like all those things, like that's fine. Quantum mechanics, where things happen, seems by probability and by chance. I mean, it makes sense to me if there are laws and there are, at some fundamental level, the possibility of acting without the right amount of energy or certain laws. Like, it kind of goes into opens the door for free will if there is probability, if there is a bit of randomness by design. But that's just my interpretation, and that's not really important here. But he continues on. Why are some parts of nature subject to law and not others? And I think that's a valid question. Or why is the law different for large-scale objects, but not these electrons and particles on the subatomic scale? I mean, these are all valid questions and need to be explored, and we're still learning things about all that. If God took pleasure in some things being subject to law and not others, then the whole argument doesn't really work. And I think he has a point here worth thinking about. Unfortunately, he says if God had a reason to do it this way, then God's subject to that reason. We'll talk more about that when he goes to the moral argument, how that's not necessarily a statement you can back up. But one can argue for a natural lawgiver, much like how you can argue for a prime mover, and God wouldn't be subject to his will or subject to the way the universe is made. Those are my responses. Those aren't what Russell's saying. The argument from design, he phrases it this way. Everything in the world is made just so that we can manage to live in the world. And he really questions that. These design arguments kind of take the form of going back and forth. Like, it seems like the world's designed this way. And someone like Voltaire would say, well, it's like your nose is designed to hold up your glasses. Well, obviously, glasses are designed to fit on your nose. It's not the other way around. So that's a fair question to the validity of how we argue these things, but it doesn't diffuse the argument completely, in my opinion. He appeals to Darwin and naturalism. Again, he shifts into a moral argument here, which is really strange. Like, millions of years of evolution, and the best thing that's produced are fascists and racists. I find that kind of strange and odd. But anyway, the universe will continue on for eons after life is extinguished. He talks a little bit about, how that's negative to some people. It's very nihilistic and somewhat depressing. And he just kind of shrugs it off. Like, none of us is going to be around in a million years when the universe, when there's no life in the universe, or the universe just fizzles out. Like, it just doesn't matter. That's just not really good enough for a lot of people, honestly. But everyone's going to struggle with those kind of questions and that worldview on their own, if they even consider it. So the more classical teleological argument, there's actually like 6 different forms of this argument, and it deals a little bit with, like we said, the prime mover and contingency and that sort of thing, but also just the arguments for design. Like, if the universe exhibits regular, purposeful patterns and order, I mean, that can't arise with unguided process or random process without an intelligent cause. This is more of like an intelligent designer argument. Like an intelligent cause would be necessary to explain order and purpose in the universe. And of course, he'll bring up, well, there are things that are against order and things that move in the other direction. But right, but there's still a standard. There's still order, potentially. I mean, that's where the discussion lies. Now, the fine-tuning argument, and probably we need modern science to really have a grasp of this that Russell didn't have. But the physical constants and initial conditions of the universe are precisely calibrated to permit life. A modest degree of shift from these constants, life would not be possible. Like water wouldn't bond and everything. So the probability of these, again, arrived by chance is small. The best explanation is intelligent design. I think this is more the intelligent design argument. Biological design. If you don't understand the complexity of the difference between inorganic matter and organic matter, I studied chemistry as an undergrad. I have a bachelor's degree. And when you look at an enzyme, you look at something in your body that just has the task of taking this compound and changing it into something else. And the number of molecules that are involved to do just that specific task. And I'll never forget, like studying at a secular institution, not like a Christian institution, small town. And my professor said, if you're going to argue from design, like look at the enzyme, like understand how many atoms are in the enzyme, in the cells, every one of your cells, and what they do. It's like, if you're going to argue for God's existence, this might be it. Like what was not something we were discussing, just saying the complexity, the irreducible complexity. And that's actually, I think, one of the other arguments. But no, sorry, this is it. Like irreducible complexity, specified complexity, can't be explained by unguided or natural processes. There's a cosmic teleology, the idea that the universe is moving toward higher complexity, life, and consciousness. And again, the goal, the direction, intelligent designer, it just follows. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each of these, but just also the fact that the universe is governed by mathematical and logical laws that are comprehensible to human minds. And Russell would say, well, we just come up with those laws to try to explain the universe, that it's not the way the universe is set up. But I mean, imagine a universe that doesn't follow mathematical or logical laws, that is not comprehensible. It's interesting that we have a world that is that way. And moving on. Oh, also the anthropic argument. The idea that the universe, and specifically the Earth's conditions, are uniquely suited for human existence and scientific discovery. Again, and the probability by this arising by chance is extremely low, if not zero. So, reason for an intelligent designer. And, each of these has its own merits and then needs to be examined on its own merits, especially the more scientific understanding we have, which doesn't necessarily, negate these arguments or negate these principles. It's also interesting that, again, Russell's an agnostic. He doesn't give any argument to say, because this is true, this is true, this is true, God doesn't exist. He objects to the validity of a lot of these arguments, but there's no positive argument. And the only positive argument, which he kind of hinted at, is, well, there's evil and suffering in the world. Like, that's the only positive argument for atheism. Sometimes we don't really talk about that. Like, there are multiple arguments for God's existence, but there's really only one argument that takes on a few different forms for, like, evils in the world, therefore a good God cannot exist, or things along those lines. And we could tackle some of that at another time, because, again, Russell doesn't really bring that up other than he thinks it's strange that fascism and racism, which again brings us to the moral argument. Kant rejected all the other classical arguments for God's existence, but he was persuaded that God exists because of the moral argument. He was so obsessed with morality and the imperative that this is what, and this is Russell explaining this. This is pretty much a fact. If you read Kant, which I haven't in great depth, but this is Russell saying this. Kant thought there would be no right or wrong unless God existed, and that's something a lot of even modern day people will argue. So Russell asks, well, is the difference between right and wrong, is that really an assumption? Again, in the Russell-Copleston debate, they really get into this. Is right and wrong based on feelings? Is it based on the consequences of the action? Regardless, he brings up the Euthyphro dilemma. He doesn't refer to it this way, but this is the Platonic dilemma, which is always important to bring about when we talk about the moral argument. Did God pick this thing and say, oh, this is evil? But he could have just as easily said, well, this is good. If so, then it's really arbitrary what's right and wrong. But if God had to say, well, this is bad because the standard is it's bad, then again, God is subject to good and bad. That's the Euthyphro dilemma. Does God or the gods, do they say this is right or wrong because it's right or wrong? There's some standard above them, or is it just what they decide? It's arbitrary. And interestingly enough, a pagan or someone who believes in multiple gods can't answer that question. Even, I've seen Mormon apologists really duck this question. So it's actually kind of useful for a Christian to know it. Because if you have multiple gods, then what's the standard of good. But if you have one God that is the standard of good, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but then you have a sufficient answer. It's not above or below God. God's the standard of goodness and perfection. He makes an aside here. I don't want people to first time misunderstood it. He makes this comment about Gnosticism, which I didn't take as like a sarcastic joke when I first read it. And I was about to get really upset about this. It's well, it's plausible that what the Gnostics believed is true, that the devil made the world when God wasn't looking. And there needs to be a bit more apologetics against the idea of Gnosticism, against the idea of Descartes. Descartes doesn't really do a lot in convincing people that this, evil demon doesn't exist that's manipulating people. Now, those are not the same thing, but I think we need a bit more apologetics in dealing with that sort of thing. But it just blows my mind that he calls something like this plausible and is arguing against, the God. And take it as a joke, take it with a bit of sarcasm. This is just something someone can throw up at a Christian, well, how do we know that Gnosticism isn't true? That's about all the comment's really worth. So again, Euthyphro, I've already tackled this. God doesn't decide, X could be good or X could be bad, depending on what kind of universe God wants to create. God doesn't say X is bad because he's subject to some sort of law. He is the standard of goodness and perfection. That's how you answer that objection. And I've already said that, so I don't really want to spend a lot of time on it. I haven't heard a lot about this argument, and I think it needs to be formulated and talked about a little bit. The argument for remedying justice, or remedying injustice. He says in this life, the good suffer and the wicked prosper. A lot of times, God, heaven, hell, and eternity are the only hope for justice. At least that's what Christians are arguing. And I think rightly so. But Russell says, of course, all I know is this world, scientifically, or maybe philosophically, given his philosophy of science. Why would any other world be free from injustice? He uses a silly analogy, like if you open a crate of oranges and the top layer is all rotten, do you think, well, maybe the next layer's good or the layer after that's good, or do you just assume it's all rotten? Um, which doesn't really help his case. I don't think it's one analogy, but could be that, you know, the next world. It's like not trusting, not knowing the scriptures or the power of God. Like if God promises the next life will be free of pain, suffering, and injustice, then it will be. But that aside, of course, he takes the view of, I think, Lucretius. He says elsewhere, you know, people believe in God because they're indoctrinated. It's safety and security, and people cause them to fear if they don't stay part of this religion and part of this group that there's going to be consequences, um, which isn't always the case. Like it's not always like what your parents said or what your babysitter, your nurses said, or things like that. He talks about that a lot in other writings, but that's not the only reason people believe in God or are part of the religion they're a part of. So the argument from divine justice, I'm going to walk through this a little bit. I understand there's some questions in the second, fourth, and fifth premise, but you know, if objective moral values and duties exist, there must be an ultimate justice in the universe. So I mean, that's fair. Now people might object to the second premise, like objective moral values and duties exist. Some will argue for a subjective morality, but what does that really mean if morality is subjective, and what are the entailments of that view? I don't have time to go into that here. Premise 3, in this life, many injustices occur without being fully rectified. Premise 4, if ultimate justice is to be achieved, there must be an afterlife where a perfectly just being ensures that all injustices are remedied. Again, are we making a leap from this to God? Perhaps. Premise 5, a perfectly just being capable of ensuring ultimate justice in an afterlife must be God. Again, are we moving from this being to God as we understand God? So the first conclusion is therefore an afterlife exists where God ensures ultimate justice, therefore God exists. Not much more to say about that. Okay, we've said a lot, but then he goes into the character of Christ, which, just fair warning, anticipation, like this is really a weird misunderstanding of a lot of things that Jesus himself said. Russell thinks he personally is in more agreement with Christ than most Christians, or most people who claim to be Christians, and he might have some right about that. I see a lot of atheists today repeating that charge, like, you know, I'm more moral than most Christians I know, which may be fair. So the first teaching he has to talk about is resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. He thinks this is unoriginal, that people like Lao Tse or the Buddha have taught things like this. Unfortunately, I don't think Christ is teaching pacifism here. And that's part of the misunderstanding. Like if someone insults you, you don't have to, you know, get back at them. And there's plenty of other passages we could turn to understand. And people disagree about this, about, you know, self-defense and, you know, maybe even like capital punishment, that sort of thing. So to say this is an original, like that's not what is being taught here. Judge not lest ye be judged. This is one of the most misunderstood verses of scripture. He's known several Christian judges. You know, what did judges who are Christian do in these law courts in all these Christian nations? Well, the text is telling you not to judge based on a standard that you yourself are guilty of, not to be a hypocrite. And like the very next verse says, you know, whatever you judge, you'll be judged by. Like if you're judging people by this standard and you're guilty of it, then you'll be judged and condemned. Like that's what's being said. It's not that you can't make judgment. We're called elsewhere to judge righteous judgment. And, you know, again, just a basic misunderstanding. Other passages he quotes, give to him that asketh of thee, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn thou not away. He makes a political statement here. Again, for an individual to give to someone who's in need and to apply that to like the political spectrum, like there's room for discussion there, like how there's a difference. So I even really think this is a good argument. If that will be perfect, go and sell all that which thou hast and give to the poor. Do some Christians maybe do this? Sure. Is this something that all Christians are commanded to do? No. Something that Jesus said to a particular individual. And the context of that and what's going on take me a little bit more time to deal with. But it's not saying that everyone has to give away their possessions, give to the poor, although Christians should not be hoarding wealth in an unhealthy or greedy way. The idea of him selling all he had, I think, is particular to Jesus's ministry. But we have to move on. He takes a view that it's doubtful if Jesus Christ ever existed, which is just intellectually silly. I know there are plenty of internet atheists who take that view. Bart Ehrman doesn't take that view today. It's intellectual, suicide to think that Jesus didn't exist. There's no criteria you can measure to try to argue that he didn't exist. The question about if he did exist, what the historical teachings are of Jesus, that's a different matter altogether. And this is really his strongest argument, but again, it's based off of popular theology and not biblical proper interpretation. He thought, the biggest defect in Jesus is that he thought that he would return within one lifetime. And that's not what Jesus taught or what the Bible teaches, but he's using passages. You shall not have gone over the cities of Israel till the Son of Man be come. I believe that's speaking of the destruction of Jerusalem, not his second advent. There are some saying here that will not taste death till the Son of Man came into his kingdom. And to me, the traditional view throughout most all of Christian history is that the church is the kingdom established on the day of Pentecost. And again, this kind of theology is only really something that popped up in the early 1800s and became popular in both Britain and America, and was definitely popular at this time in Britain, probably less so now. But the church, Christianity, did come into existence in the first century within a lifetime, not even a matter of days after the crucifixion. Taking a thought for tomorrow is not based on that understanding. It's just taking a thought for tomorrow means, don't worry about tomorrow in context of the Sermon on the Mount. It doesn't even touch on these other issues. So I could say a lot more about that, but he thought the belief in hell is a moral problem. Earlier on, it's interesting, I guess Parliament had made it clear that you don't have to believe in an eternal hell to be a Christian, because, in England, church and state are pretty closely combined, so they can decide the sort of thing. But if Jesus taught about hell and he believed in hell, then that's a moral problem. And honestly, the Warren Barnhart debate is mainly about utilitarian ethics versus Christian ethics, but this concept of hell comes up a lot. So I don't have much to say about it here. Socrates would not condemn anyone to torment for not listening to him. Okay, well, the easy answer is Socrates wasn't divine, but moving on. He says, and I'm quoting, "You'll find in the Gospels Christ said, 'Ye serpents, ye generation of vipers, how can ye escape the damnation of hell?' That was said to people who did not like his preaching." The Pharisees were just not people who didn't like his preaching. The Pharisees were, the Pharisees didn't have a better true religion than Christ. They had a false religion based off of, divine principles. But so understanding the context and a lot more than just quote mining is really helpful. Whoever speaketh against the Holy Ghost shall not be forgiven. He says that causes a lot of people to have fear and concern. Not if we really properly understand it, not if we look at the context. People who witness a miracle and, call Jesus Satan or call him, the names that Russell's calling him, Not that he's never witnessed a miracle, but you see my point. He calls hellfire as punishment for sin a doctrine of cruelty. Yeah, that's his feeling, that's his estimation. It might be something that Christians struggle with, but it's something that, again, this doesn't really disprove anything, or doesn't really. What's helpful for me is if you argue that the wicked are punished eternally, or you argue that the wicked are annihilated, like they no longer exist. I don't think that's scriptural, but let's say that. I've had people say, the eternal torment is bad, is like the worst thing imaginable. I've had people say, oh, I would much rather burn in hell for eternity than cease to exist. Like the idea of cease to exist is existentially more frightening than eternal torment. So when you realize that, like if you want to have a discussion about whether hell is just punishment for sin against an infinite God, then that's a conversation to have. But a lot of the objections are based off of subjective feelings of what we think would be preferable or not preferable. So it's really not even addressing the core issue. He talks about the swine being cast to the ocean. I don't think anyone really knows the context of what's going on there, why these demonic beings, why this occurred. It wasn't exactly Jesus forced them to do that, as far as I can understand the text. So I don't really understand the objection here. The cursing of the fig tree seems like an object lesson. Like if Jesus sees a fig tree and he cursed it, think about, other things that, God can curse and what will become of them. It's not really a good explanation for that passage, but I don't understand he wasn't being impetuous. He wasn't like, oh, there's no food here, as if he didn't, have the possibility of already knowing there would be no figs on the tree, and that he curses it, and the apostles, learn something from it. So again, there's an emotional factor that enters into it. People say that without faith, men will just be wicked. Of course, he can always go in to say, well, have people who've claimed to be Christians throughout history, have they not been wicked? With the Inquisition, the witch hunts, many times, unfortunately, Christians do oppose, law reform, peace as opposed to war. They've opposed racism and slavery. Of course, some have made a point to oppose or to support these things, like an end to slavery, and an end to law reform, where they've been locked in prison because they refused to fight in a war they didn't agree with. He paints religion to be against every moral progress, and unfortunately, many who claim to be Christians have done so. But is that what Jesus teaches? And it's an emotional appeal. It has to do with a lot of emotional factors. I think he specifies something explicitly against the Catholic Church and some of the ways that people's lives are ruined by ultimately dogma. And like I understand to an extent, like being dogmatic can lead to problems, power plays, and that sort of thing. Now, we can be confident in what the Bible teaches, and we can have discussions about what the Bible teaches, but there is something to be said about not being dogmatic about a great number of things, about opening dialogue about, even these things, even, well, does God exist? So that's pretty much it. And again, I tried to give an answer, a brief answer, as much as I could. And it might not be really satisfactory. It might have been better if I just went through the arguments for God's existence, maybe tackled some of the arguments, or the argument against God's existence, the problem of evil and suffering, and that sort of thing. But I just wanted to have something to reference. And there's always a chance, I hope this hasn't brought doubt in anyone's mind. about the Christian faith or about God. That wasn't my intent. But I do want to try to hear these objections, try to be able to answer them. I don't think we need to live in an echo chamber where the writings of Bertrand Russell aren't like something that we're familiar with, that we don't recognize these arguments as we hear them. And so we've realized, oh, there's a more modern answer to these sort of thing, or there's just an ongoing debate that has not been settled the way that some have claimed it's been settled, or that whatever the case may be. So if you'd like to see more content like this, you have suggestions or things you want me to review, again, if this interests you, see how Russell kind of struggles a bit to bring his worldview against someone like Copleston in that debate. I almost want to do a review of that debate, but there's so much logic and epistemology and ontology mixed in with it that it's hard for people to follow who don't have a firm grasp of those aspects of philosophy. But if you're interested in this, I'd recommend go watching that or listening to the audio at least. I don't think a video exists, but there are videos that contain the audio of that debate, and it's rather interesting. I don't have any